My name is Eric Maslowski, and in this tutorial we're going to be continuing the organic modeling series and look specifically at the ear. The ear is a really messy, nasty piece of geometry that we have to create. Very complex because there's a lot of overhangs, bumps, and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how we can actually use a similar method that we did for the face and apply it to the ear, just to make it a little bit easier to get that flow of geometry. Okay, so first thing is load up our reference image, zoom in quite close to the ear, and then like before we're just going to go and define some key areas. Okay, so after some work, you should have something like this. Okay, so you can see just very rough, a couple key areas defined. Okay, so now from this point, what we want to do is we want to start drawing in our actual topology. So the same idea as before, just start connecting the lines wherever possible, and then also make some new ones. So just work your way around to creating the necessary quads. After some work, you should have something similar to this. If we take a look at our guidelines, you can see that for the most part, the edges flow nicely along our guidelines. Now don't worry about making this too complex, because we'll end up adding all the detail necessary to get all these overhangs and pits. All we want right here is we just want to make sure that we have a nice flow of quads over our entire surface. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this into 3D Studio Max. Naturally we'll save it first. We'll take it into 3D Studio Max and start sculpting our ear. Okay, so here we are in 3D Studio Max. We have our head model loaded, and if we press F4 on the keyboard, we can see all our edges. Now, when sculpting the back of the head and the neck, make sure to keep a couple faces set aside for where we want our ear to join up. So in actuality, we really don't even need the head at this point, because we have really good reference photos and we basically built this head off of those same reference photos. So we're just going to select our head, hide it, which is underneath the display menu, and then click on or uncheck hide frozen objects. Okay, so here we go. We got our front, left perspective view. If we go into our left view and zoom in pretty close, you can see this is really pixelated. Now if we were just looking at the general guidelines, we could probably get away with it, but for the ear it's just a muddled mess. So what we need to do is we need to change the resolution of the downloaded texture size. So 3D Studio Max, when it loads up any bitmaps to be viewed in the viewport, it uses a predefined size, so say 256 or 512 or similar. And so every texture that gets downloaded will conform to that size. So what we need to do is we need to override that setting to tell 3D Studio Max to give us all the detail. And we do that through the Customize menu at the top of the screen, Preferences, Viewports tab, then Configure Driver. Now underneath Configure Driver near the bottom, we have Download Texture Size. Currently it's set to 256. So if any texture is above 256, it'll scale it down to it. What we want is match bitmap size as closely as possible. The little checkbox underneath. Just click it, click OK, OK. Now you notice nothing really changed. What we have to do is we have to tell 3D Studio Max to reload the texture with the new settings. So if we jump over to our material editor by pressing M on the keyboard, we have our reference plane texture right up here. click on the little M next to diffuse, and then right underneath our file name for this bitmap, we just click on reload. Now you'll notice that it became much clearer. And this is exactly what we wanted with this. Okay, so now what we're going to do at this point is we're just going to zoom in fairly close, go over to create, shapes, then line. Make sure that the initial type and drag type are both set to corner, and then we're just going to start drawing our shapes again. This is identical to how we ended up creating the face initially. Again, you might want to put on snaps to make your life a little bit quicker, and then just work your way around your geometry. Okay, so once you go through and you create all of your quads, attach them together and create a surface out of them, then we'll start adding some depth to it. But just as a quick reminder for how to take your shapes and create them into a surface. Remember, you select one of your quads, go over to the Modify panel, apply an Edit Poly modifier to it, then on the right hand side underneath Edit Geometry, just go ahead and attach all the rest. Once you have them all attached, you need to drop into vertex mode, click and drag over all your vertices, go to underneath Edit Vertices, go to the little box next to Weld, and then check to make sure that the threshold is okay. Click OK, and now we have a nice continuous surface. Okay, so let's get into actually sculpting this ear. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we just basically want to line it up with our front reference plane. So we move it over. We can see that our current reference plane is actually too far forward. So what we're going to do is we're going to just move it back. So we go over to the display panel, underneath freeze. We do unfreeze by hit. We click on that front facing reference plane. Click on it again to select it. Move over to our left viewport and just drag it all the way behind the ear. We'll now go back to our display panel underneath freeze and click on freeze selected. So now we're right back to where we started. You can clearly see our ear plane here. And now we just start pulling some of these points out, much like we did before. So I'm actually going to switch this perspective view over to a front, zoom in nice and close, and then adjust my viewports so that I get a little bit of a closer view. Okay, and so I can see what I'm doing. So in this case, like with the face, it was easiest to start with the line going right down the middle. In this case, we want to start with the outer rim. Now remember, when you bring it over, a lot of times you don't want to keep it solid like this because it'll be very difficult to see, what's going on. So you can press Alt-X on the keyboard to make it semi-transparent. And so here we're just going through and lining up the outer ring, and then we'll go in and modify the inner ring. And so you just want to kind of create your surface, just very rough, placement. Because a lot of our ear is occluded by his cheek, by his hair, by the angle of the camera, we're not going to be following these references too closely. We're really just going to be using them as a really quick start. Okay, now here I am after pulling out a lot of different points, moving them around, and so on. Now, the way that I ended up creating kind of like this overhang here is basically by using various Edit Poly features. And we'll do the same for the ear canal. So if we take a look at our reference image, we can see that we have certain faces that we need to bring back. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into edge mode, select the edges that we're interested in, and press Alt X to make sure we're selecting the right ones. Okay, and we basically just want to kind of like trace around the pit area, and I brought those up too far. Okay, so these are the edges that define what we want to bring back. So now that we have those selected, on the right hand side all the way to edit edges, we want to click on chamfer. If we click on the little box next to it, drop our amount to 0, and then slowly increase this. So we just want to create a little border around all those edges. So in this case, very, very small value. Click OK. Now let's take a really close look at what we just created. Now we have two sets of lines here, which are good, but if you notice some of these corners, they look pretty messy. So we're actually going to have to go in and clean those up a little bit. So if we go over to Edge, go to our Select tool, and select the smaller edge there. Now on the right hand side underneath Edit Geometry, you just click on Collapse. And as you can see, what that did was it keeps all our quads, but gets rid of that little annoying corner. So we'll do that one more time. Go over here, collapse. There we go. Now we're going to do it for the rest of these little edges that show up. Okay, so there we go. We now have a nice clean border all the way around. Okay, now before we go on, I just want to show you another method of doing the same thing. And this one actually uses faces instead of edges. So if we go over to polygon mode, right up here at the top, and underneath edit polygons, okay, we're going to be using the inset feature. But before we click on it, we need to select the faces that we want to operate on. So again, similar ones. Then we click on the little box next to inset. Drag the value all the way down to 0, and then slowly increase it. Now, you'll notice that the corners don't suffer from the same effect as an edge chamfer. Now, both of them have their places. Feel free to use whichever one you feel more comfortable with. But in this case here, we'll just use this. Click OK. And so now we have a really nice selection that we can just move back into our head. So if we jump over to our perspective view and have a look at what this looks like, it may be a little bit hard to tell if what we did is what we actually want, because what we have here is a very low polygon view of the ear. So often when I'm making an ear, what I'll do is I'll add a turbo smooth modifier on top of it, just so I can get a much better representation of what I just did. And so now I can just go in and start pulling these points around a little bit more. Now often when you're working with turbo smooth on your modifier stack, you want to see what you're doing. You want to see the end result. And so we can do that with this little button directly to the right of the the push pin. So if we click on that, we still have our low resolution cage, but we can also see the high resolution model as we're tweaking. Okay, so let's spend some time just going ahead, finishing this up, and then we'll move on to how to add it to the head and how to do the back of it. Okay, so here's our ear so far. Okay, it doesn't have a back to it, but we do have very nice edge flow going throughout the entire ear, and it looks to match up quite nicely with the underlying geometry, or the reference plates, I should say. Okay, so now we're going to go over to the display panel, unhide by name, choose a head, unhide. And so what we want to do at this point, since we use the reference plates, the same reference plates, for modeling the head as well as the ear, we really don't have to do much in alignment. We know exactly where the ear has to be. So we don't have to move it to get it to fit onto the head. But what we do need to do is stitch it to the head, or attach it to the head. Now right now, you can see it doesn't have, any backing to it, and the head is one continuous surface. So let's go over to select our head, go down to Editable Poly. Let's first select the two faces that we set aside for the ear, and let's also select the ones up in front of the ear, just to give us a little room to work with when stitching this geometry to the rest of the head. Okay, so we have that all set. We'll select our ear, remove Turbo Smooth, just so that we have a nice clear idea of our topology and what's going to need to line up with what. Okay, now often when I'm at this stage, I will end up just start adding a little bit of thickness to the ear, not necessarily completing the entire ear, but just giving it some thickness so I know roughly what the topology is going to look like in the back here, so I can match it up properly to the back of the head. So let's handle that. So if we select our ear and press Alt-Q, select just the ear, press Alt-Q to isolate it. Okay, so there we go. Drop into the Edit Poly mode, go to Edges, select one of our edges on the top of the ear, and then click on Loop. And now try to select all the edges that fall under that loop. Now we don't need all of these, so we're just going to detach or remove a few from our selection. And we can do that by holding down Alt and then clicking and dragging over those edges. Okay, so here we go. Alright, so it looks good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to give this some thickness. Now my favorite method for doing this is to switch over to the Move tool, hold down Shift on the keyboard, and then click and drag on your edges. In this case I chose the X-axis to just bring it completely to the left. What this does is it copies the edges and bridges the new edges to the old with faces. So it builds up a surface very, very quickly. So you can just scale up over another, switch to scale mode, and shrink it down a bit. And so now if we turn on Turbo Smooth to get an idea, we can start to see our ear take shape. So now let's take a look a little bit further down the line after we've refined and simplified the back here. and get started on attaching it to the rest of the head. Before we do so, I just want to point out one more thing. If we look at the back of our head, you can see that we have very few edges to attach. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to simplify what we have here. We have far too many segments or edges on the back here to line up cleanly. So, for example, if we go over to our polygon mode, underneath Edit Geometry, click on Create, remember that we can simplify by joining up edges that may not otherwise be joined up. So, like for example, instead of just bringing these all straight back, creating 3 unique edges and polygons, we can just create a single polygon, and thus significantly dropping our count down. So go ahead and work on that, and let's jump ahead to see the end result. Okay, so here we go. We have the ear. I just have a Turbo Smooth applied. So let's turn that off and see the geometry. Not much different from what we left it. Okay, so now let's take a look at actually joining this to the head. So we get out of isolation mode. Here is our head, and we're now going to start building up edges and faces to line everything together. Now this gets really tricky, okay, so because the areas are very close together, it's a little difficult to navigate sometimes, so I almost always have the head on Alt-Q so that I can see right through it, but I can also see the various edges that exist. So now we're going to jump over to our ear, go to Edit Poly, go to Vertex, and we can see that there's this vertex there, and then this area. So we want to look to see how we can start to line things up. So, turn on Snap, go to our Move tool, I'm going to take this one, drag it down over there. Take this one and drag it up. So there, we started to bridge that gap. And so we just want to continue in a similar way. So all the way around. And if we need more faces, like say on the front here, we can just use our copy technique of holding down Shift and then clicking and dragging. We can then bring the vertices together and start laying this out in whatever way we feel it has to be laid out. So again, Shift and drag, switch over to vertex mode, can turn on Snap, and just attach it together. Okay, so let's take a look at the final geometry for the ear. Okay, so here we go. This is the final geometry for the ear. You can kind of see how we had to make some pretty strange looking quads just to bridge up the edge of the ear to the rest of the head. Up along the top, gets really tight. Now I didn't spend a whole lot of time on the back here. This is a little bit more stretching than I'd like, or you know, long thin triangles, which you always want to avoid. But since it's in the back of the ear, don't plan on having any shots right up close here, and the ear itself will occlude it in almost all situations. I'm not concerned about it too much. And then you can see added some more thickness to the earlobe. And one other thing that I did was I added additional indentations right up along here. So let's take a look at what this looks like when smoothed. There we go. Now I'll probably end up tweaking this a little bit more just to get a little bit more of an organic flow. Right now it looks like that is just one hard ridge when it should actually dip in and adjust itself a little bit. But that is the basics of creating an ear. Very complex shape, but by using that spline method we can ensure that our topology is nice, smooth, and flowing. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or post them on the forums. Alright, thanks a lot. Bye.